Okay, wonderful. So what we talked about in the last video are strategies that firms can use to get a larger share of the surplus generated by their market power, right, their market position, by charging different prices to different types of people. Either directly, right, by, for example, offering senior citizen discounts or student discounts, or charging different prices for people who use Amazon with a Mac or a PC, or indirectly, right, with strategies like offering discounts for bulk purchases, or offering discounts or surcharges when you bundle two types of goods together, right, where demand is going to differ between high and low elasticity consumers. But that's not going to get us all the way to capturing the full surplus generated by our market, because for a specific individual, right, for any particular consumer, the consumer is likely to be willing to pay more for their first unit of output than for their last unit of output. In other words, in circumstances where I have an individual demand curve that's downward sloping, charging any particular price, right, to that individual is going to leave them with a consumer surplus, and it's going to leave a deadweight loss, right? So we're going to end up missing out on a big part of the total surplus that we could get from selling to that individual by charging them any particular price, even if we pick the exact right price for every specific person. So what we're going to talk about in this video is strategies we could use as a firm to try to capture more of this total surplus generated by an interaction with a specific customer, either by charging different prices for different numbers of units or through other means and other methods. So to think about this, let's make this a little bit concrete by imagining that you are Northeast Los Angeles, Highland Park's only purveyor of goat yoga services, right? There's a couple chicken yogas and cat yogas, but nothing is really giving you the real deal, right? And let's imagine that, of course, everybody in Highland Park wants goat yoga, so there's no differences between your customers in terms of their demand curves. But for an individual person, the first goat yoga class per month is going to be worth more to them than their last goat yoga class per month, right? So we can imagine that each individual demander has a demand curve that looks something like little QD of P is going to equal, let's say, 10 minus 1/10 P. Right? In other words, their inverse demand, P of Q, is going to be 100 minus 10Q. Cool? So if we graph this thing, we're going to end up with a straight line like this, right? With a maximum price anyone's going to be willing to pay for goat yoga is going to be 100 for 0. And the maximum quantity anyone's going to consume is 10 sessions of goat yoga. Right after that, your back starts to hurt. It's really not fun anymore. Cool. And on top of this, let's imagine that we've got, again, a constant marginal cost. Let's keep things simple. Let's imagine that I've got a price cost function that's just equal to 20Q, so my marginal cost is just going to be 20. Don't know why I dotted that one. Right, marginal cost of 20. Demand curve like this. Great. So, of course, right, if I wanted to find the price I could charge this person to maximize my profits, I would just find my marginal revenue. Right, which would just be 100 minus 20Q. Set that equal to marginal cost. Right, end up with a Q that's something like 80 over 20, or 4. Right? So I would say my best option is going to be to have 4 goat yoga sessions, have a price of, let's see, 100 minus 40 is 60 bucks, right, and end up with a profit given by this rectangle right here, right? And as we were saying, right, I'm going to leave some money on the table relative to the total surplus available here because my goat yoga attendees are going to get a consumer surplus. And because I'm selling 60 goat yoga sessions, whereas marginal cost equals price at, I'm selling 4 goat yoga sessions when marginal cost equals price at 8 goat yoga sessions, right, there's also going to be a deadweight loss right there. Right? So this is the situation. And my goal as a firm, right, when I'm thinking about pricing strategies to deal with this situation, is going to be to try to get more of this consumer surplus, more of this deadweight loss into my pocket, right? I don't want to go into my customers. I certainly don't want it going to nobody. One strategy to deal with this, right, which we've already talked about, is perfect price discrimination, right? I charge $100 for your first moment of goat yoga, $90 for your, after an hour, $80 after 2 hours, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in order to get this whole surplus. But this is going to be difficult in a couple of ways. One way is I need to know the exact shape of the demand curve, as we've talked about, for this individual. But the other issue is just that it's a very complicated pricing strategy to describe to someone, right? Someone shows up wanting to take some goat yoga classes. I'm going to have to give them this pricing chart that's long and confusing and maybe a little bit irritating. So as an alternative, let's say that I wanted to, instead of charging a bunch of different prices, I wanted a relatively simple pricing strategy that was going to try to accomplish the same thing. I'm going to call this pricing strategy a two-part tariff. I'm trying to spell tariff correctly, right? So the idea with a two-part tariff is, I'm going to charge you 2 prices. The first price, which we've already talked about, is a per unit price, right? A price per class. Price per unit, which I'll call P still. And then I'll charge you the tariff, right? Which is essentially going to be something like a membership fee. So I'm going to call this T, right? Membership fee. Right, so I say, you've got to become a member of the Goat Yoga Association and charge you some membership fee T. Once you've paid that membership, you're going to be able to pay a per unit price for each hour of goat yoga you consume. Right, so this is a strategy that we actually see all over the place, right? If you're Costco, you have to buy a membership in order to go in and buy your groceries. If you're the cable company, right, you might charge an installation fee and then charge a monthly fee or a fee for data. This is the idea that we're going for here. So the question's going to be, right, the thing we've got to think about is if we're going to have this pricing strategy, how do we pick P and T in order to maximize our total profits? And the way I want you to think about this is to note that we've got 2 sources of revenue here, right? So our total revenue is going to be T plus Q times P, right? And of course our cost is going to be C of Q, right? So our profit is going to be, in this case where we've got constant marginal cost, it's particularly straightforward, right? It's going to be T plus QP minus C of Q. Cool. So to think about how to maximize this, let's just pick a profit, pick a price, then figure out what our tariff could be, and see how much money we make. So as an example, let's say, just picking out of a hat, let's say I decided I wanted to charge a price like $40. Right, so we'll put that right here. So if I charge the price at $40, what are my consumers going to do, assuming that they pay the tariff? Well, they're going to purchase the number of units they would like at a price of $40. Right, so we're going to say that QD of P, 40, it's going to be 10 minus 1/10 times 40, which is of course going to be, right, 10 minus 4 is 6. Right, so they would go to 6 goat yoga classes. And I would make money off of those 6 classes, off of my price, right? So QP minus C of Q would be, right, 6 times 40 minus 20, which is going to be $120. Right? In other words, this area of profit here is going to be $120. Great. Now, what's the tariff that I can charge? Right? In other words, if I'm going to be selling my goat yoga classes for $40 per class, how much could I charge for access to goat yoga overall in order to keep my customer satisfied? Well, to think about this, what we need to know is how much is a customer willing to pay to access the goat yoga market, right? Which is going to be another way of saying what's the benefit in dollars to the consumer of accessing the goat yoga market. And that, of course, is just going to be the consumer surplus, right? This area here. So the consumer surplus at a given price is going to be the maximum tariff, right? So T would equal the consumer surplus. I'll say T has to be less than or equal to consumer surplus, right? And what's the consumer surplus at a price of 40? It would be the rise, right, 100 minus 40, times the run, which is 6, over 2, which is going to be 60 times 3, which is going to be 180. Right, so this is going to be 180. So my total profit, my total profit is going to be 180 plus 120, which is going to be 300. Cool. In other words, my total profit, right, is going to be this blue area plus this red rectangle. It's going to be this kind of trapezoidal shape right here. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Consumers get nothing, right, assuming I set the tariff just right. But in this situation, we haven't completely eliminated our deadweight loss. So we haven't completely captured all of the potential benefit of the goat yoga market. So how could we capture this last little triangle of profit here? Should we raise our price, lower our tariff? Should we lower our price and raise our tariff? Well, if we lowered our price, that would increase the consumer surplus, which means that we would increase the tariff that we could charge, right? It would also, of course, increase the number of units that are being sold, but it would decrease the size of this red rectangle. Can we think about whether it's worth it? Well, if we lower our price, right, we shrink our rectangle, our red rectangle, but all of the reduction in red rectangle goes into consumer surplus, and therefore is going to be an increase in tariff. So the only change is going to be that we'll get a little bit of this deadweight loss back. Given this, what's the best we can possibly do? Well, the best we can possibly do is charging the price that maximizes our total surplus, because then we can grab back all the consumer surplus by charging the tariff. In other words, the best we can do in this case, right, is charging a price of 20, price equals marginal cost, getting us to our socially optimal output, and then charging a tariff equal to the value of the consumer surplus in this market. This make sense? In other words, we charge a price of 20, right? When we charge a price of 20, our red rectangle, P times Q minus C of Q, is going to equal 0, right? It's going to be equal to 20 times the consumption of 20, which is 8, minus C of Q, which is 20 times 8, is 0. But our tariff is going to equal our consumer surplus, which is going to equal the area of this whole rectangle here, right? So that's going to be 100 minus 20 times 8 over 2, which is going to be 80 times 4, which is going to be 320. Right, so by lowering our tariff all the way down to 20, we're going to be able to get the entirety of this consumer surplus and deadweight loss as profit. And we'll do just as well on this pricing scheme as we would by perfectly price discriminating, right? Charging a different price for every single unit of output. So why is this better than perfectly price discriminating? There's really two advantages. The first advantage, as we've already talked about, is that it's simpler, right? This is a fee structure, right? Charging a membership fee and a cost per unit that as a consumer, it's easy to get your head around, right? It's easy enough to understand that you're not going to get mad about the details of the price, or not as mad. But it's also better because of the amount of information it requires the business to understand. If you're trying to perfectly price discriminate, you need to know the surplus from every single unit. In other words, you need to know the exact shape of your demand curve. If you want to charge a profit maximizing two-part tariff, you do need to know the size of the consumer surplus at your various levels of tariff. But you don't need to know the exact shape or where exactly that consumer surplus is coming from, unit by unit. Right? So if you're trying to experiment to find your right price, it's much, much easier to experiment with a two-part tariff. You first have to know, right, what's my marginal cost? That's something you can figure out just by looking at your own data. And then you can gradually raise or lower your tariffs and see what tariff level gives you the maximum profit. Right? Given that if your consumers aren't identical, as you raise your tariff, you're going to drive some people out of the market. As you lower your tariff, you're going to give some people some residual consumer surplus. Wonderful. Now, as I mentioned, right, this kind of strategy is extremely common in the real world, right? We see this with businesses like Costco that charge a membership fee to access their store at all. You see this with, for example, gym memberships often work in this strategy. But you also see this in maybe some more surprising or difficult to recognize places. So, for example, you could argue that Netflix is an example of a two-part tariff, right? Instead of charging you a different price for each movie or each TV show that you watch, they're essentially going to charge you a cost that represents your consumer surplus from having access to Netflix. And then their price, right, the price they charge you to watch each show is zero because their marginal costs of providing you a streaming show are in fact zero. Right? In other words, they're charging you a two-part tariff where the tariff is the only piece of the price that you actually see. And similarly, right, it may be even more easy to see, Amazon Prime uses the same strategy, right? We charge you a monthly fee, and then we allow you from that monthly fee to get discounts down to marginal cost on all sorts of different Amazon products and services, right? Lower cost of shipping, et cetera, et cetera. So one thing I was thinking about when I was putting this together is, if we see this as the model for Netflix, right, that we're going to charge you a monthly subscription fee because of the fact that the marginal cost of using products is going to be zero, why don't we see this pricing strategy, for example, for Kindle books? Right? Why wouldn't we use a two-part tariff and say, I'm going to charge you a monthly subscription fee to access all of the books in the Kindle library? And one potential reason for this might be because if you're selling a diverse array of products, right? If you're something like Netflix or Costco, you're going to have to figure out, in order to do this, the consumer surplus, the effect on consumer surplus of each of the different products that you're providing. Right? In other words, you need to know whether it's worth it to make a deal with a particular publisher for a particular title in their books. And the best way to find that out is to see consumers' willingness to pay for those books, right? To charge someone a fee and see how many people are willing to pay the fee. If you're Netflix, this isn't that big of a deal, the fact that you don't have that sort of consumer purchasing behavior for your shows, because you have a relatively small catalog, right? You don't have that many shows. Your biggest shows are the ones that matter the most. So it's worth it to do all sorts of careful, fancy analysis to see whether adding a particular show to Netflix increased subscription retention or not. But if you're selling books, right, you've got millions and millions of titles of books, that might be incredibly difficult to do. That might be why we don't see that strategy when it comes to book size. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to throw one last pricing strategy at you, and then I'll get out of your face and let you enjoy your day. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this video. So the last thing I want to talk to you about is another strategy to capture more of the surplus from an individual that doesn't require quite as much information as perfect price discrimination, or quite as much complexity, but has a little bit of that flavor. So the idea here is, say that I'm offering my goat yoga, but I'm not quite willing to do a two-part tariff, right? Maybe I'm worried that, I need to let people experience the joys of goat yoga before forcing them to commit to a subscription fee. So I've got my demand curve, right, is, what did I say, 10 minus 1/10 Q. Right, I've got my marginal cost of 20. And what we said before, that I was charging a single price, the price would be 60, and I know that my consumers would end up purchasing 4 units apiece, right? And I would get this rectangle profit. Now, as we've said, right, I would love to sell them more units, right? I would love to continue making a deal with them up until I can get down to a price of 20 and sell 8 Goat Yoga classes. But I'm not willing to drop my price on the first 4 units in order to do that. So one strategy here, to get some more of this surplus, some more of this deadweight loss, would be to say, I'm going to give you a discount once you've bought 4 units, right? So I might say something to you like, once you've bought 4 Goat Yoga classes, you can get, let's say, 2 more at half price, right? So I'll sell you up to 6 for a price of 30 bucks. So you know what, I'll sell you 3 more at half price. Yeah, so at half price, if I'm charging a price of 30, consumers are willing to pay 10 minus 30 over 10, so they'd be willing to buy 7 classes. So I'd be able to sell an extra 3 classes, right, at a price of 30 bucks. And that would let me add this little chunk to my profit, right, taken out of the deadweight losses. Now, in some sense, this is very similar to perfect price discrimination, right? If I chunked up my prices enough, I would get to perfect price discrimination. But this is a slightly simpler and slightly more common version of this, right? You're essentially able to say to someone, I'm offering you a quantity discount given that you've purchased a certain amount already. And if you were to take this strategy really far, you might also say that your first couple classes are going to be at a surcharge, right? I'm going to charge you 90 bucks for your first class, right? Add a new member fee or something like this. 60 bucks for your next 3 classes, 30 bucks for your next 3 classes. And by doing this, right, as I chunk up my prices in more and more fine grain, I'm going to get more and more of your consumer surplus from you, more and more of the deadweight loss from you, and get closer and closer to capturing the total surplus value of the Goat Yoga market. And again, right, this is something that we see all the time. At some level, anytime you've got a business that tells you, you know, if you buy 2 pints of ice cream, you can get the second one half price off, or, you know, you've got your punch card for your burritos, right, and if you eat 10 burritos, you get the 11th free. All of these are going to be strategies aimed at block pricing, right? Same thing if you get a loyalty card at your grocery store or other regular shopping place, right? You might get a discount based on prior purchasing behavior. So I just want to say a few last words to kind of sum up all of this work that we've done. So all of the strategies that we've talked about have really been aimed at the same overarching goal, right? Which is to allow firms to capture a larger portion of the total surplus generated by their presence in the market, right? When you're a firm that's selling a unique piece of output, your existence is generating a potential surplus. You want as much of that surplus as possible. And the way that firms have been capturing these surpluses, right, all these strategies we've talked about, have required knowing information about their customers that allow them to target prices and special deals in order to get as much of that surplus as possible. So the last thing I want to say about this is just to say a word about how we might want to feel about this. In some senses, these strategies we've talked about are really good and useful things for the economy, right? Because they're giving firms the opportunity to reduce the amount of deadweight loss associated with market power. In other words, it's getting us, in a world with unique firms that produce unique products, it's getting us closer to those market efficiencies, closer to the welfare theorems, than we would be if firms were only charging single prices to everyone. But on the other hand, it's allowing firms to capture more of the consumer surplus than they would if they didn't have the ability to price discriminate. And as a result, we might worry that a world with greater levels of price discrimination, greater ability to price discriminate, is going to be a world where more of the gains of economic growth, more of the benefits of economic activity are going to go towards the owners of firms, or the owners of capital, as opposed to towards individual consumers. Now, the reason this is important, the reason this is particularly important now, is that we live in a world where data about consumers is getting more sophisticated every single day. And the tools to analyze that data is also getting more sophisticated every single day. One of the big areas that we talk about this, right, is social media, that people are providing information about their habits, their preferences, their interest in different advertisements to large digital companies all the time. But this is also going to be true if we think about purchases made with credit or debit cards, right, which generate a track record of consumer behavior. If we think about loyalty cards or loyalty points in businesses, and if we think about e-commerce, it's unavoidable, right? If you're using Amazon a lot, as I do, right, you're generating a track record for a large corporation with lots of great analytics of exactly how you've reacted to different prices at different points in time, and exactly what your interests and preferences might be. So what this means is that as people who are developing data analytical skills, this is a potentially massive area for us to go into, but as consumers and as citizens, right, we might worry that while this might result in greater economic efficiency in some respects, it might also result in greater inequalities between the owners of capital, the owners of businesses, and everybody else. And there's different ways we can approach that, right? We might think about, as individuals or as citizens, limiting the ability of firms to own or appropriate people's data. There was just a ballot proposition in California doing exactly this to try to limit the ability of firms to price discriminate. But we also might think about embracing the possibility that price discrimination is going to be a large and growing aspect of the economy, but use other tools to try to make sure that the gains from these activities are distributed more evenly, if this is something that we're worried about, right? Such as, for example, increasing taxes on larger corporations or organizations that have the ability to use this data. It also might be a reason for us to predict real changes in the world around us as time moves on. One of the big advantages of being big, right, of being a corporate entity with lots of different locations, is the fact that you have more data at your disposal, can make better business decisions than small entities. And so one thing I worry a lot about, or think a lot about, is the extent to which the kind of businesses that are currently fairly small business dominated are going to become increasingly corporate over time. So I think I mentioned my wife's a veterinarian. In veterinary medicine, this is an enormous, very, very rapid trend that small veterinary practices are being bought up by a small number of corporations that can use analytics to set prices for procedures in a much more sophisticated way than individual firms can. The same is likely to be true of restaurants, medical practices, dentists, all sorts of places where we've generally seen in the past individual or small proprietors. And so this is another thing for us to be thinking about, and think about how we want to react to that as individuals. Okay, thank you so much for sticking with me. Look forward to talking to you about this soon.